Hey folks, it's Ardwulf. Welcome. Today we have an unboxing of a product that has been very long anticipated by me and by other fans of the great campaigns of the American Civil War series. This is, of course, On to Richmond II, and we'll talk about the contents of this as we go and how those relate to previous products in the series that this revisits, as well as including new material. Now, for those who don't know, there was a small snafu on MMP's side on this. Some trimming was required to some of the maps, and it turns out that had not been done, so they paused shipping these after just a few days, I think, of shipping them out when they discovered the error, and they reprinted the maps in really very good time. And resumed shipping. I had put in my pre-order a little late, which is, that's on me. And MMP does ship pre-orders in the order in which they were received. So I was not amongst the first wave as I'd hoping I'd been. But there were reasons why I waited when I waited, and here it is. So we are happy. The first thing we notice, first of all, beyond the excellent packaging that MMP put this box in with fragile labels all over it and stuff like that, very well packed, is that it is in a 3-inch box, which is the first example of a Great Campaigns of the American Civil War series in a box this big. And the reason for that is related to the fact that it is a fairly expensive product. If you have noticed that on the MMP website, even the pre-order price was relatively expensive. I'm not going to quote you numbers because it's like 11:30 p.m. and I'm not going to try and dredge those out of the miserable swamp that is my memory at this time. But it's a fairly expensive game, but there are basically 3 full games in here, right? In this box, we have a new edition of On to Richmond, which for many years was one of the most sought after and definitely the most expensive on the secondary market of the games in the series, as well as Grant Takes Command, which was the first product released by MMP in the series years ago. And that felt like it hung around for a while, but that also has been going for a pretty penny on the secondary market, as well as a new module called the Petersburg campaign. Now, I am not going to have a problem. We're going to take a look at this once we get the box open to see what the storage options look like, but I'm not going to have any problem getting it into this 3-inch box because I'm going to 3D print countertrace for it. And in fact, I have been printing 3D printed countertrace for it for the last several days. Thanks to that hole in the shrink wrap, we didn't need to bust the knife out. So let's open the box up and see what we get. First of all, we observe 2 standard multi-man publishing dice. Second, we have a list. On to Richmond II should contain a box and a lid, 4 22 by 34 inch maps, 5 counter sheets, 1 GCACW 1.5 series rulebook, 1 On to Richmond rulebook, 1 Grant Takes Command rulebook, 1 Petersburg campaign rulebook, 6 player aid cards, 2 charts and tables, 1 off-map theater display, and 2 dice. So I'm just going to bust this because MMP kind of collates this in their own unique order. I am going to pile everything up and then we'll have a look at it. So we get a book, which is On to Richmond. We get a counter sheet. We get a TEC card. We get a map. We get another counter sheet. We get a standard GCACW charts and tables. We get the Great Campaigns of the American Civil War Standard Basic Game Rules version 1.5. So we're going to talk about what I believe has changed in this edition of the basic rules, which is basically nothing, but I'll get into the details of that in a minute. We get another counter sheet. We get another, and these are on 11 by 17. Reasonably heavy cardstock. I'd call it for player aid cards, I'd call it a medium heavy cardstock, fairly shiny. Standard tables and stuff. We have the Petersburg campaign book. We have an On to Richmond II Union Force display. There'll be a Confederate one somewhere. We have another counter sheet. We'll take a look at all of this stuff in detail momentarily because I've been waiting for this for a long time. Here's the Grant Takes Command book. Here is the off-map display, this is rather nice, which is an odd size, and it actually shows you how the maps lay out, where you have the Grant Takes Command north and south, and then On to Richmond north map. And then this is going to be for so the maps have been reoriented in this version so that they mesh together better. And we've got a 4th map here. I'll be honest, I didn't expect this, but I was kind of hoping that they'd send me the miscut maps along in the box because I would like the opportunity to put them on the wall. And if I have extras, I can do that. Now, I have all the original games in the series, so I can really do that. And they're just as nice and pretty, really. So we have a Petersburg campaign turn track here, okay? As you can see, there's a lot of turns. The turns are daily turns, but there are multiple things that happen inside each turn. I have done some video on the basic play structure and at least a couple of sort of teach and plays on GBACW. So check those out by all means. Or if you're inclined to go very deep into this series, you can check out another YouTube channel called Patrick's Tactics and Tutorials. And he does other things too, but he has done a lot with Great Campaigns, the American Civil War, as far as playthrough video goes. It is an excellent channel that I highly recommend. Okay, so we got the off-map display, and I'll point out that the front side, if you will, is Grant Takes Command off-map theater, and the back side is the Petersburg campaign turn track. Now, we do have the two force displays. Again, these are going to be single-sided because you're going to probably put these under the plexi. This is your Fog of War mechanic for GCACW. It is optional, but if you're playing a larger scenario, I definitely recommend playing with it. I don't think you need to deal with it if you're still trying to learn the system. We also have a Grant Takes Command turn track here. These are both, okay, both single-sided. And then over here you have a movement track, which I'll be honest, I never really use. And victory points and manpower losses track. So this is to track the number of movement points you have remaining with the unit you are activating at the moment. And if you do an involved combat, it's pretty easy to forget how many movement points you have left. That said, when it has felt necessary, I have just used dice that I set out on the map instead to keep track of that rather than pushing counters on this track. But that is entirely my choice. All right, so that goes back in the box. We've got the two, as mentioned, charts and tables books. There's only one terrain effects chart. However, terrain is critically important in this series. However, a lot of it kind of functions the same, and these individual movement point costs are often not relevant because you're usually moving on the road. So I guess if I'd have expected two of these, but if there's only one, I don't really care too much. All right, next we'll take a look at the maps because I'm going to show you the glory, if you haven't seen them already, that is Great Campaigns, the American Civil War maps. We do have 4 of them, and these are maps by the great artist Charles Kibler. As has been the case with every game in the series, all the way back to the days of Avalon Hill, except for the original Grant Takes Command, which had maps done in the GCACW style, but they were done by Rick Barber instead of Charlie Kibler. And they're really nice too, but they do look different, right? They don't quite match, even though you can technically line all the maps up. Now, those of us who've been playing this series well will recall that although I wasn't playing at the time, some of the original modules, you did have to actually trim the maps yourself, and Avalon Hill wasn't about to do that for you. So absolutely gorgeous. In my opinion, these are amongst the finest maps in all of tabletop wargaming. So I get to look at the counters last. Let's look at the 4 large books that we get. So the series rules dates from the first issue of the GCACW magazine, the Skirmisher, which they've done 3 issues of now, and there is a 4th that should be on the way. These are all, by the way, on sort of a heavy magazine stock. The core rulebook here is 24 pages with fairly small print and not an absolute ton of illustrations. We do have a nice retrospective, GCACW 31 years later, by the originator of the series, Joe Belkowski, who has returned with Hood Strikes North, the last game in the series, actually. So as the series rules, the series rules that appeared in the Skirmisher also appeared in Grant Takes Command, again, MMP's first game in the series. And as MMP there were a lot of special game-specific rules in there so that you could use those series rules to play any of the preceding games in the series. So as they have reprinted and revised all the different games in turn, those game-specific rules that apply to, say, Grant Takes Command or On to Richmond or whatever, have been moved to the game-specific rule books and removed from the basic game rules. So as a result, this actually is a shorter rule book than we might have seen in the past. So what I expect the changes are here are absolutely minuscule and trivial stuff, and removing from the core rules the specific rules from Grand Takes Command and onto Richmond. Okay, and those will now appear in here. So once again, this is a brilliant system. It is an activation-based mechanic where you actually roll to determine who is going to get to activate next, and they can pass, and when you both pass, the turn's over. Units accrue fatigue as they continue to do things, and eventually they will run out of gas. It is a classic system that really highlights operational maneuver. There is also... it's not really going to be in the basic game rules, but there is a basic game which has scenarios, some of which are quite large. And there's an advanced game which has both scenarios and campaigns. And the campaigns are very large, but some of the basic game scenarios are very large. If you don't ever advance to the advanced game, you are still going to get a great deal of play value out of any GCACW game. And if I have said GBACW at any point in this video, I apologize. This is the Great Campaigns of the American Civil War and not the Great Battles of the American Civil War. Another good series that I highly recommend. There are some optional rules in here. Limited intelligence, that's the Fog of War rule. That's as simple as there are off-map displays and force markers that you move around on the map. You can use cavalry to scout and therefore reveal the contents of those stacks. Highly recommended, like I said, for larger or longer games. But if you don't use it, you're still going to get a lot of play value out of this. I would use it for any game longer than about 3 turns, I think. Unless it was intended as a teaching game. So again, fairly small print. The rules are, I would say, really, really elegant in a lot of ways. And they are really pretty fiddly in a couple of places. The battle rules, when you have the larger set piece battles, is one of the places in which the rules are fairly fiddly. So we have 3 campaign books. And when I said that this box basically contains 3 separate games, these are them. On to Richmond, which is the Peninsula campaign. McClellan invades the peninsula. The 7 days battles occur when Robert E. Lee makes his reputation by basically spanking an overly cautious McClellan. Grant Takes Command is the Overland campaign in 1864, which includes the Battle of the Wilderness and the Petersburg campaign. Now, I'm very interested in seeing what this covers exactly, but we'll take a look. We'll at least do a quick flip through of each of the books. So let's start with the titular On to Richmond book. This is on the same stock that the basic rules are on, but this is a 64-page book. Now, previous game in the series, relatively recent, Roads to Gettysburg II, put all 3 campaigns together in one perfect bound book. I much prefer this solution. Okay, so I don't have to, if I'm just playing On to Richmond, I can just use this book and not have to paw through a larger book trying to find what I need and mangling all of the contents. And I strongly prefer the staple bindings for wargame materials rather than perfect bindings, which in my experience tend to fall apart. That said, my Roads to Gettysburg II book has not fallen apart, so apparently they did a pretty good job on it. And it's not like that's gotten no play. So there's going to be a lot of scenarios in here. Where's the table of contents? My fingers are not sticky enough. So there are, On to Richmond, there are 8 basic game scenarios. There is 1 advanced game scenario for the Peninsula campaign. And the advanced rules tend to cover things like supply and reinforcements, and logistics that aren't necessarily simulated in the turn by turn and activation by activation of the basic game system. So it's not like you're going to play basic game scenarios with the advanced rules, although that does sometimes come up. All right, so the scenarios. The Warwick Line. This is a 3-turn scenario, and it's also relatively small. Here are the deployments for setup. This is the Confederate setup. Here's the Union setup, and each of these lines is essentially either a unit or a leader. So this is not an enormous scenario. It is a 3-day scenario, and I do think it's valuable for a first game or 2 of GCACW to not play one of the 1-turn scenarios, because the tendency, without having to worry about what happens tomorrow, is that you will run all your units out to fatigue 4 and they'll be done. And you wouldn't necessarily want to do that in a longer scenario. 3 turns is also not that many, because it could take several days if you run your guys all the way up to fatigue 4. Scenario 2 is Johnson's Retreat. 5 turns. This is May 1862. Scenario 3 is To the Gates of Richmond. Presumably, this is where McClellan really got very close. I forget the exact number of miles to Richmond, and was turned back by Robert E. Lee. And you can see this is a quite large scenario. Quite large in the sense of there's a lot of pieces to move, but I want to talk about counter density in GC-ACW, which can get high due to markers. You're really not very often stacking units together, but each unit can have several markers on it. So some people prefer to play with off-map displays to hold all the status and manpower markers for the units. That definitely decreases map clutter. I'm not aware of any generic ones for the system. You could easily do that on index cards that you scribble on. But that's kind of recommended for larger scenarios. Scenario 4 is the, I don't want to say well-known Battle of Seven Pines, or Fair Oaks, if you will. But it's well-known among people who are into the American Civil War. Let me put it that way. Here's Stuart's Ride. Recreates Jeb Stuart's first daring raid of the war, the ride around McClellan. And that's a 6-turn scenario. The 7 days. So this is going to be your kind of big basic game scenario. And as you can see, there's kind of a lot of special rules for it. But looks like some of these at least only apply on certain turns. This is only 7 turns though, but it's going to be pretty big, right? 7 turns, 7 days, right? 1 turn is 1 day. And then you can activate, in principle, each unit up to 4 times in a turn, assuming they start with no fatigue and they end at fatigue 4. Scenario 7 is Gaines Mill, and again, another kind of classic Civil War battle that maybe the folks that aren't super into Civil War haven't heard of, but this is 2 turns. And then scenario 8, Retreat to the James. McClellan runs away very bravely. This is 3 turns, June 29th to July 1st, 1862. Okay, so, and then we get into so there's 24, 25 pages of scenarios. There are some game-specific rules in the front, but nowadays, these are pretty lean. It's pretty much this page and a little bit of the next page, and that's it. And very little of this is actual rules, right? These leader activations, pontoon bridges, there's a limit on those. Other than that, everything looks like it's built into the scenarios, to be completely honest. And they give you a guide to the abbreviations as well, which is handy if you're not familiar with them. All right, so advanced game rules include, there's a somewhat modified sequence of play with more stuff happening. You get this is very interesting. At the start of the game, the Union player must declare where he wishes to invade. He has 4 choices: the Peninsula, Tappahannock, Mobjack Bay, or Urbana. Very interesting. We have strategic events. We have a Union command posture rule. Random end of an action cycle. That's something we've seen here and there in the series. Strategic movement, which comes into play with the really long scenarios. But like Roads to Gettysburg 2 has some basic game scenarios that are like 30 turns or something like that. So just because they're basic game scenarios doesn't mean they're short necessarily, although none of these are especially long. But it'll take you a whole day to play through a 7 or 8 turn scenario, unless you are very proficient and pretty fast. Then it might take you 3 or 4 hours, maybe. That's optimistic, I think, but not by too much. Strategic movement, railroad movement. You can also do things like burn rail stations and stuff like that. Oh, here's the Virginia and the Monitor. That's very interesting. Played roles in this campaign, as indeed they did. Amphibious movement, which obviously we need for this. Union gunboats, presumably patrolling up the James, maybe. County control, which tends to be one of the things that drives victory in the advanced game campaigns. the Shenandoah Valley. Events in the Shenandoah Valley may influence the campaign. Very interesting. So the next volume in the series, I'm not sure if it's going to be the next volume or not. I know of two projects for GCACW that are in the works. One of which is a new set of the Valley campaigns. Now that's going to redo Stonewall in the Valley, which is actually the largest single game map footprint of the entire series, as well as including the 1864 campaign by Sheridan in the Shenandoah Valley, in addition to the 1862 campaign by Stonewall Jackson. That's material has been floating around for a while in an unofficial capacity, so I'm very much looking forward to that. The other thing that I'm aware of is that there is a Vicksburg campaign in the works, and I will be obviously very interested in seeing that too. Here we get into supply. You do actually have supply that you cart around the map. It's not quite like OCS, but where you get individual, you kind of do have individual supply points to be thinking about it. You have supply units that you spend. Union siege artillery substitute units, so you can kind of break units down. That's basically what that is. Johnston and Lee, because Joe Johnston got replaced here. Drury's Bluff, that's one of the special events, and end of game. And here is the advanced game scenario. There's only one, but it is 112 turns, April 5th to July 25th, 1862, but the game can end earlier. So we have Union set up a peninsula, constant reinforcements, off-map boxes. So it looks like your Union setup depends on where your invasion point is. And then we have Confederate setups for the different invasion points too, is what it sounds like. Okay, so this is like a lot of setup information, but you're not going to be using it all. One of the really interesting and kind of awesome things that have been included in a lot of the games in the series, at least, is this section, The Game as History. And this one's by Joe Belkowski. And in here, what Belkowski is basically doing is kind of walking you through the historical progress of the campaign in the terms of the game. I find these exceptionally illuminating, and I wish more games would include this exact thing, actually. So we have several pages of this. On to Richmond credits. Original design, Joe Belkowski. Well, it just says OTR game design and development. I think original designer is Joe Belkowski, and this version designers are Joe Belkowski and Ed Beach. Series game design, of course, by Joe Belkowski. Maps by Charlie Kibler. Graphic design by Charlie and Nick Scooby. Rules layout by Nick Richardson, and a whole bunch of stuff. I don't know if there's a Vassal module available to the public yet, but that's coming at some point. And the Vassal modules for the games in the series are generally excellent. So the Grant Takes Command book is next, and it is a 72-page door stopper. And in here we again have 8 basic scenarios, but now we have, I have Grant Takes Command, but I've never played it, and I really haven't looked at it that closely. This has 2 advanced game scenarios and 2 grand campaign scenarios. So basic game rules here look like they're along the same lines, so very little in the way of game-specific stuff here. We have Scenario 1, the Battle of the Wilderness, 2 turns, May 1864. We have Grant crosses the Rapidan. That's 5 turns, like nice and meaty scenario. We have the Race for Spotsylvania, 1 turn. That's pretty small. But again, I might surprise myself here, but I think if I was picking this box up and it was my introduction to the game series, I would start with On to Richmond. For a couple of reasons. One, it's got a number of short but not too short scenarios. And also, that campaign really highlights the value of maneuver, which is one of the series' great strong points. Bloody Spotsylvania. Sheridan rides south for 4 turns. Strike them a blow. 4 turns. This is May 21st to May 24th. Bethesda Church, 3 turns. Several of these are only 1-map scenarios as well. Trevilian Station, not sure I'm pronouncing that correctly, but oh well. 5 turns on that. And then here we get to the advanced game rules. Now I'm going to blow through this because a lot of the little specifics are going to be different, but The basic flow of it is the same. You have a separate advanced game sequence of play, and a bunch of game-specific things. And the Bermuda 100 campaign, which may also influence this particular campaign. Very interesting. Wouldn't mind seeing a game on that, actually. Transfer, supply, how to build depots, substitute units, and none of generally, maybe with the exception of Atlanta is Ours, I've never felt like the advanced game rules are particularly convoluted. I mean, they add quite a bit of mechanical weight, but they are not particularly fiddly. Substitute units again, activate army leaders, Confederate forts, Upton, Confederate reorganization, end of game. Now here we have, this is the standard advanced game covering all 40 days of the campaign. So May 4th to June 12th, 1864. But as usual, it might end earlier. And here's the victory conditions. Union setup, you can see this is fairly large. This is quite large, actually. And you're going to play this on the north map, half of the south map, and the left half of the on to Richmond north map. The unused map portions can be folded over and are considered off map. I would never do that. I might put displays over it. So here's Marching to Cold Harbor. This is an abbreviated advanced game covering the final confrontation in front of Richmond. It's not that abbreviated. It's still 17 turns and is fairly large. Manpower values here are not off the charts. So the way the setups are going to work is pretty much as straightforward as it looks like. Here's the unit or leader that you're looking to set up. Here's the size of the unit, whether it's a division or a brigade. Here's the type of unit that it is. And that's all on the counter so far. But then you also have a manpower value. And that is a manpower numerical counter that sits under the unit that tells you how much manpower that the unit has and whether it is organized or disorganized. You flip it over when it's disorganized, and then it only counts for about roughly 2/3 its normal full strength because they're disorganized. And we'll take a look at that in a couple minutes here. Grand Campaign Extra Rules. So these are changes and additions to the advanced game to enable play of 2 Grand Campaign scenarios with Stonewall in the Valley and onto Richmond maps. Okay, that's very interesting. Now, I do have Stonewall in the Valley, and it's another one of those campaigns that really plays to the strengths of the system because it's all about maneuver. So the Grand Campaign includes even extra maps that we don't have in the new versions, but you could use, although there'd be a bit of a graphical mismatch, they still look really good. The old maps still look really good. Scenario 11, that's 40 turns. And then the next Grand Campaign is If It Takes All Summer, which is 17 turns. So those are kind of fattened up versions of the other campaign scenarios. And then here we have The Game is History. This time it's by Ed Beach, and it's only 4 pages, unfortunately, 4 or 5 pages. 5 and a little bit pages, so not quite as long as the one on to Richmond. We do have some further reading here. Can't say I've read any of those particular books. I have, I think, one book on the wilderness, Battle of the Wilderness, but I haven't read it yet. And then we have the new campaign, or again, each of these campaigns, there is some sharing of components, right, as far as maps and counters go. But each of these campaigns is really the size of a full game and provides you with the play value of a really play value rich game. So basic game rules here. Looks like it's a little more than we're getting elsewhere, which isn't surprising considering how late this is, because you're going to have different types of fortifications available. Entrenchments in this case. All forts and redoubts printed on the map are Confederate. 63 plus on some of those features indicate that fort only exists for in or after 1863. So there's some special map features that are relevant to this particular campaign. Scenario 1, my best achievement, uses the On to Richmond South map, and it is 2 turns. Scenario 2, the Battle of Jerusalem Plank Road, which I am totally unfamiliar with. That is 2 turns. I'm not really very familiar with this campaign, except the very highest level. Sheridan crosses the James, 4 turns. Ooh, the Crater. 4 turns. This is an infamously bloody battle that was Grant really takes the responsibility for. The Battle of the Crater was not his finest moment. The 4th offensive. This is 8 turns and used both of the On to Richmond maps. The 5th offensive, 4 turns. These are not monstrously long scenarios. Burgess Mill for 1 turn. Hatcher's Run for 2 turns. 5 Forks is 2 turns. So these scenarios tend to be on the shorter side. Retreat to Appomattox. Oh, very, very momentous. Awesome. All right, and advanced game rolls, once again, we've got a big pile of advanced game rolls, which without examining in detail, I'm not going to be able to... there's different stuff in all of them, right? Like this cohesion check, I don't think we see in all the game's advanced rules. And certainly something like the Pennsylvania 100 campaign effects on this campaign is not something that we see in every campaign. Okay. Confederate division leaders, that's something we don't always see as well. Okay. Looking for the campaign, and my fingers are not doing great right now. All right, so the Petersburg campaign at a blockbuster 296 turns. May I recommend Vassal for that? You are going to use 3 maps for this. 296 turns. Wow. Entire Petersburg campaign starting in mid-June 1864 after Cold Harbor. Moves through winter. Now, you may have like lull mechanics in this one too, because it is going over the winter. I'm not sure. You do in Atlanta is hours. And as you can see, there's a decent amount of setup here. The number of individual units on the map in GCACW is not necessarily that high. But if you don't use the off-map displays, then counter clutter can mean there's actually a lot of counters on the map, even if a lot of them aren't units. The last offensive, final Union offensive in spring 1865. Very end of the war here. All right. And we have The Game is History by Chris Withers, who is another person on the GCACW team. And in this case, we have only 3 pages. So, I mean, I could have a whole book of this as far as I'm concerned. All right, so we have spent a lot of time looking through the books, and there's an enormous quantity of material in here, and you could play, frankly, the contents of this game for years, and I think feel like you, expensive though it might be, that you got your money's worth. All right, so this is counter sheet 5, and it is a marker sheet. And on here we have markers for fatigue. As I mentioned, units accrue fatigue as they continue to activate, as well as markers for destroyed bridges and railroad stations, and a large number of different kind of fortifications. The fortification situation kind of evolves as the war evolves in GCACW. So we'll see, for example, there'll be dates on some of these. So this is, I don't know how that's pronounced, Abatis. These are for 1864, while these forts are for 1862. These breastworks are for 1862. These forts under construction are for 1864. Now, we also have, very interesting. Okay. We have 2 sheets, one for the Confederates and one for the Union, which are mostly the manpower markers. And the manpower in these campaigns, I didn't look that closely at the numbers in the scenarios, range from 1. Most cavalry units will be 1 or 2 manpower, by the way. It's pretty unusual to see more than that. All the way up to 21 for both. You notice there's 2 21 counters for the Confederates and 5 for the Union. And then if we look at the back of the 21 strength, we're going to see that it's actually only 14 combat value, but it's still got the little 21 as an exponent, because it's 21 manpower. And 21 manpower means certain things, like regarding how much it costs to move through a hex containing 21 manpower. So whether they're disorganized or not, it's still 21 manpower in the hex. And you've got to pay for that. So the manpower situation, there's a lot of manpower involved in this campaign. We also have a variety of Confederate-specific markers and some Union ones still here, too, although those might be doubles. Some of them, those are pretty much all Union, actually, as well as some general markers, too. I'm not sure what these mean yet. And then on the Union sheet, we've got pretty much the same type of stuff. We've got redoubts for both the Union and Confederates, as well as artillery counters. And then we have the units. Okay, now this is laid out. I am not sure how well you're going to be able to see this on camera, because it's not incredibly obvious here, but my camera's pretty good. So you might notice a difference in the blue color down here versus the blue color up here. And what that signifies here is that you've got sort of two different counter sets. One for 1862, one for 1864 and 65. So the lighter colors are for 1862 and the somewhat darker colors are for 1864 and 1865. Okay, so you're actually going to be able to sort this by campaign, not scenario, although I guess you could do that if you wanted to. But, you know, if you like GCACW as much as I do, you're going to want to play through all the campaigns sooner or later. So I would not set my counters up with a specific scenario in mind. The colors do indicate sort of higher echelon units. You'll notice that those Confederate higher echelon units are quite large. So I'm not sure how well you can see the color difference, but the 1862s are a little lighter. And that way that gives you a visual clue as to how to sort. We're going to take a look at the rest of the box here. Now, I'll also mention that MMP had sort of a brief flirtation with a different way to present the counters that was used in Battle Above the Clouds and the first printing of Stonewall Jackson's Way 2. And they rolled that back with the second printing of Stonewall Jackson's Way 2 and with Roads to Gettysburg 2 and Atlanta Is Ours to this somewhat more old-fashioned counter layout. And although I didn't have a huge problem with the somewhat more elaborate looking counters in say Battle Over the Clouds, I do find the information on this style of counter to be cleaner to the eye and easier to parse. So I am happy to have counters done in this style. So once again, there's 4 maps, 4 books, and 4 counter sheet and 5 counter sheets. So let's do an experiment here before we sign off for the evening. And let's put all the stuff back in the box and see approximately how much space we have left in the box. Because we do get a 3-inch box for this, and it kind of looks like I'll be able to get 3 counter trays in it. And if, as I do, you store your markers, including manpower, in a separate box or separate tray, then you can easily get each of the 2 counter mixes into one tray and then one for the markers. I think that would work. So amount of free space in the box looks like it's about 2.5 inches. Or just a little under 6 centimeters. A standard GMT counter tray, if you don't know, is roughly 15 millimeters high. So you can get 3, and maybe, without the counter sheets, of course, maybe even 4 counter trays in here. So I do not feel, although I will do my own thing when it comes to fancy 3D printed counter trays, available to patrons at the $5 and up level. The models are available, I should say, not the physical trays, which I do not have the capacity to manufacture. But I don't feel like that's absolutely necessary here. I think with 5 counter sheets, 3 trays, I'm pretty comfortable fitting 5 counter sheets into 3 trays normally. So I think that's totally workable. I don't think you need to work up an elaborate storage solution to this. So props to MMP for putting this thing in a 3-inch box in the first place. Again, I store my markers outside the game boxes. But with that in mind, I managed to get all of the GCACW games in their boxes. And this will be the first one that I do in 3D printed counter trays. And if you want to see a video on that, please mention it in the comments. So this has been a rather lengthy look, but it's a product I'm pretty excited about, so I'm happy to finally add it to the library. On to Richmond II, The Union Strikes South. This is volume 13 in the Great Campaigns of the American Civil War series. And I think we're going to say that the series design is Joe Belkowski, and the game design, if you count all the various pieces, is going to be Joe Belkowski, Ed Beach, and Chris Withers. I think that's how that plays out. I didn't check the credits for all the different books. So tons of value in here, and I think we can safely speculate that once this goes out of print, it will be going for some absolutely ridiculous price on the secondary market, as all the other games in the series do. So this is a series that I highly recommend. Like I said, I've got video on it. Patrick's Tactics and Tutorials is another great YouTube-based resource for GCACW. Also highly recommended. Just delighted that this has finally arrived. So I'd like to give a special shout out to the patrons of Ardwulf's Lair, without whose support and encouragement it would be impossible to keep doing the stuff that we do here at the channel. Thank you, patron. Please do thumbs up the video and subscribe to the channel for more wargaming content. Thank you all for watching, and until next time, happy wargaming.